right. Welcome everybody to a investing in identity forum. I am your host and moderator today, Travis Jarae. I'm the CEO of One World Identity. Just really quick on OWI, we're a research and advisory firm focused on identity, trust, and the data economy. We do a few things here. We do growth strategy, transaction services, and product innovation and design, as well as some market intelligence work. And I know many of you guys work with us on those types of initiatives. But let's jump right into today's session on investing in identity. If this is your first time checking out this session, we do it monthly. So please do put it to your calendar, add it to your calendar. Make sure you guys come back at the end of every month. We do a roundup of all of the deals that we are following as a firm, as well as some of the big trends that are happening out in the market. We'll cover two different stories on a monthly basis, as well as some of our predictions here as we go. And today's speakers, which are the same speakers that you're going to have every month, myself, Cameron D'Ambrosi, Managing Director here at OWI, and Dave Fields, partner at PTB Ventures. Welcome, guys, to a very hot and muggy June session.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we're doing it. All right, so let's jump into some of these deals. We have Cameron's awesome emoji explosion head to kind of represent, I think, this month. You know, leading up into June, we saw a lot of really large Series A, Series B, some Series C financings, as well as some pretty interesting M&A activity. Every time something happens, I think the ground shakes a little bit, but not more than it did this month. Starting things off was TrulyU with that near $400 million raise, putting them at $1.75 billion valuation. Trulyu's been around for quite some time. I think this is a really remarkable kind of stat. This is a company that kind of was leading our wave two identity companies, which is more about building pipes and data connections and getting to the cloud. And now you have them kind of leading us into wave as well, which is about kind of that decentralized identity schemes and getting to kind of orchestration platforms. And so this money here really represents what we can see as strong investor interest in the market with TrulyU as they kind of progress and as this market continues to grow. So really exciting to see them to do this raise. Second, to follow that up, so we went from the biggest fundraise in the identity market with near $400 million to the biggest fundraise in identity, which was $543 million with Transmit Security, trying to do the passwordless revolution. And I think they're seeing a lot of success there. And I know we're going to talk about them here shortly. And then last but not least, on the top three, because there were many deals this month, was Clear going for their IPO, valuing the company at $4.3 billion after kind of a very checkered past, and then of course going into COVID. You saw their business be disrupted, but I think strong leadership, good technology, and a really great brand, frankly, has carried these guys forward, and they're definitely poised to win a pretty large segment of our market. All right, let's jump over to some of the notable M&A activity as well. We had, kind of leading off with Pangiam acquiring TrueFace. I think this is a really interesting acquisition for a number of different reasons. I'm sure we're going to talk about that here on this next slide as we look at the landscape. But generally speaking, if you guys aren't familiar with Pangiam, they are taking a run at the seamless travel experience and piecing together components that make that experience happen. So this is everything from biometrics to onboarding technology. I think this is a really great pickup for the Pangiam team. And again, we'll talk about more about how that plays into the landscape here shortly. Second was Mitek acquiring ID R&D. This is the first acquisition after Mitek raised that $150 million or so a couple months ago for the purpose of acquisitions. So it kind of tells you what they're looking at, right? Small tuck-ins, building out their integrated identity platform, making sure that they keep up with the other large platform solutions out there like Jumio, like Onfido, and now with TrulyU's large bank. Right, we expect them to play a major role and be highly competitive against Mitek here. So expect to see more from Mitek from this front. And then NCAP Security. So this was an acquisition from All Clear ID back in 2016, if you guys recall, to give them a presence in Europe for a lot of the emerging regulations happening in the space, as GDPR, your PSD2. I think that did that. All Clear ID divested some of their business around the identity theft protection and that type of kind of world, really going heavy into the authentication side of things. We knew that they had a strong partnership with SignaCap. I think this is a really great signal for SignaCap, recently raising a bunch of money. We're seeing kind of that consolidation, lots of opportunity in the bank ID sector, which is what we actually talked about last month. So this obviously kind of double clicks on that opportunity for SignaCap and other Nordic-based or even European-based bank ID programs riding the open banking waves. And then last but not least, of course, is Prove acquiring Unify ID. We've always been big fans of Unify ID here at OWY. We think what they built is really, really cool. As identity nerds, definitely one of the cooler kind of companies out there. I think this is a great acquisition for Prove. It gives them that behavioral biometric signal, gets them into the mobile device in a stronger way than what they could previously have. So I think this is a really great pickup for Prove, but also probably one of many, right? If you look at Prove and what they're trying to accomplish, being a major competitor, tying legal identities, government issued identities with mobile devices, and now with that extra additional layer on top of that around the behavioral data. I think this is a really great pickup. It shows kind of a little bit about Prove's strategy going forward. But let's jump into the map here, and then I'll open it up to Cameron and to Dave here. So first off, we have TrulyU, right? TrulyU, if we're looking at the landscape, really kind of plays in these three major areas. Of course, you can probably extend a lot of these out across multiple different segments, but really in the IDV, the KYC, the regulatory compliance space. Cameron, what are your thoughts on TrulyU? What do you think about this fundraise, and what do you think they can do with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting. I think it's a vote of confidence for the continued ability to see growth in this, KYC identity verification space. I think where you see TrulyU playing in these three market segments, room to continue expanding. And we have predicted before, and I think we're going to continue to predict that companies like TrulyU are going to need to continue to expand across that digital identity lifecycle, as it were, as we continue to see these larger platforms. We've referred to them colloquially as Death Stars before on this webinar and other forums, and I think you're going to see that trend continue. You saw on Fido coming in with a big raise previously, and I think this is a case of TrulyU to some degree having to keep up with the Joneses. So going to be really exciting to watch and see how these large players continue to expand and compete with one another with these respective war chests that they've accumulated.
Yeah, and you brought up on Fido there, and of course, they recently made the undercover announcement that they're discussing whether they're going to IPO in Europe or in New York. So, that just tells you that they are going to IPO. At least that's the intention. So they will have a new sized war chest to kind of continue to play with. But Dave, what are your thoughts on TrulyU here? When we first started talking about this was the biggest raise. Then Transmit happens.
Right.
But, kind of what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, so there's really a couple different things happening in sort of the onboarding or identity verification segment of the market. I mean, one thing I would point out is that I think the headline number was 394 million on a 1.7-ish valuation. So I think it's important actually when you talk about TrulyU and Transmit, which we'll get to more in a second, is say these companies, when you look at the valuation numbers that they're sharing and the size of the raise. Investors are buying about 20% of the company, which, given the stage that these companies are at, where there's not really market risk or product risk anymore, that's selling a much larger stake of the company than ordinarily you would see in one of these growth rounds, where really you're just, you're funding, sales and marketing, which is really just, you're really just taking some amount of execution risk at this stage of the company. So ordinarily, so what that tells me that, when they're selling 20% of the company rather than selling sort of 5 to 10% of the company, is that there's a large secondary component in these transactions. Secondary being you're buying shares from other shareholders rather than primary shares, which are shares directly issued by the company. Money is going into the company's, cash is being funded on the company's balance sheet. So there's some component of primary and secondary in there. So I just want to point that out, just a little sort of, VC or investor inside baseball. The other point I would make that I think is interesting in IDV is that we're seeing multiple companies raise 9-figure rounds at unicorn valuations. I think it would be very common at this stage of the market to start to see a greater stratification in the companies themselves. And we're seeing, several companies which are all now hitting sort of like very similar valuations at basically the exact same time. In technology markets, we've been seeing, people talk about winner take all, winner take most. Oftentimes that's driven by network effects where, as you add more users, the value to all users gets bigger. The value to all users grows, which creates sort of a compounding effect, or, people call it compounding effects, flywheel effects. That improves your economic moat, your pricing power sometimes. It doesn't look like we're seeing that in the identity verification market. To add as another sort of like data point to compare this to like access management as a category, Okta right now is worth 38 billion as their market cap, Ping's around 2 billion. And we've seen ForgeRock in the news reports discussing their IPO, they're sort of targeting a $3 billion valuation. So, 85-90% of that market value is accruing to Okta, where we have these two other companies, which are very significant, very, great companies, but really a fraction of the value of the product leader. And we're not seeing that happen yet. We're not really seeing that happen in identity verification. And so, to me, that reflects that, to what extent are there these sort of network effects or winner take all or winner take most effects in this category. And I don't think they're there. And so I don't think that's a bad thing. It's a sign of that the market is really, really big. It can support and sustain multiple big players, big companies, great companies. And we're just not going to see all the benefits consolidate into like just, one or two winners. And that's probably, it's probably a good thing actually. For the market as a whole, or consumers and enterprises. And so that's kind of like the big takeaway for me. I mean, we'll get into, I know, Transmit in a second.
Let's actually jump into Transmit here to keep that going with you, because I think you're touching on a lot of good points here.
Yeah, I mean, so, Transmit, the first thing I would make on their financing round is, here's another one where, the headline was, here's a $500 million Series A. It's like a record, et cetera, et cetera. Transmit has two very successful co-founders that's previously had very large exits. So I know at different points in different articles, they talked about the company having been bootstrapped, which typically implies that you're not really funding losses. You've built, a shoestring budget, you've probably built some initial product, and you've just been able to use reinvested cash flows to get to a certain stage. I do think Transmit, the founders, there was a TechCrunch article a few years ago. I think that the founders put like 30 or 40 million dollars of their own capital into the company at inception. Now they've gotten to, so like that to most people was like a Series A or a Series B size round. Now these definitions are getting very squishy. Now they've gotten to a point where it's $500 million round. I know a big component of that again was secondary. It's clearly a company that is having some success. I think if you look at, I don't know exactly where they are revenue wise. My sense is that they're somewhere either potentially approaching on a forward basis, which means I think looking out a couple of quarters, my understanding is that they've got line of sight on getting to about $100 million run rate. So this company is being valued at north of 20 times price to sales on a forward basis, which I think is probably twice the multiple that most of the identity verification companies are getting. So that's a SaaS business. SaaS tends to be a little stickier, recurring, so people are more comfortable underwriting a higher multiple. And then I do wonder if, particularly in authentication and fraud and risk, anywhere where you're using sort of, if you're using probabilistic data, or you're doing something where there is a fraud and risk component, I do think there tends to be more of a network effect where the more devices that are brought onto your platform that you can, more identities that more devices that then there are some security advantages that accrue to all users of that platform. So this is much more of an enterprise infrastructure play, whereas identity verification is much more of a API transaction play. And so I think in this category, we are going to start to see, maybe not winner take all, but we're going to see consolidation, and we're going to see much fewer, like we're going to start to see some stratification that we've seen in other markets in the sort of authentication and fraud and risk market. And so I know Transmit, I don't think they're really in fraud and risk per se, but they are in some sort of consumer checkout, and I know they've got great relationships with banks and some of the other sort of large retailers that are going digital. So I think that's kind of the big points that I would hit from an investor and sort of like a market structure standpoint.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that could definitely be argued that, a lot of their authentication is used for, fraud and risk. So definitely, worth kind of giving them the hat tip there. Yep. But I mean, you're really kind of hitting on a major point here, which is the difference between a lot of these deterministic data businesses that are mostly API driven checks, very transactional, to the probabilistic and user managed data, if we're going to stick to the dominant data types here on this chart, which have been a bit more mature in figuring out kind of the SaaS-based business model. I think what we are starting to see a lot more of is an active discussion, and I think some very active decisions on switching the business models from transaction-based to something that's a bit more SaaS-like in the IDV and deterministic data type of businesses down here, or segments at the bottom of this map. And so I think there's there's probably gonna be a lot of trial and error around figuring out what those right pricing models and pricing structures are going to look like. And I think there's going to be a few people that are burned, but also on top of that, I do, to your point, around the valuations and kind of 20x price to sales multiple and forward-looking projections. I'm expecting to see those types of numbers start to hit the headlines within a couple months here. As those business models shift. But
just one last point that I would just make on the probabilistic versus deterministic. Probabilistic data, your interpretation of it is far more subjective. So deterministic, it's much harder to build a proprietary data set or an economic moat based around deterministic data, because it's just you're more likely to be an aggregator and distributor of it. Versus actually being a proprietary form or interpretation of it. And so I think that's to get maybe into the data science and how does that then translate to market valuations. I think that's one of the key points there. And if you now look at some of the I think M&A activity, we're going to start to see some interesting combinations where people use they built up great distribution and client rosters, and now can you start to merge and blend some of these different categories to create really interesting market solutions.
That's a really, I think, key insight. Let's move on to Clear here. Cameron, you have been kind of keeping up with this with a lot with the kind of the seamless travel experience and a lot of these user experiences. Obviously, Clear going public isn't a huge surprise. I think we're all kind of waiting for this for a very long time. It's exciting to see it. What are your thoughts on Clear and also just the general market that Clear plays in?
I think that this is another space that we are expecting to heat up in terms of the competitive landscape. I know we have another transaction following this one that also is kind of playing in this travel space, and some of that Apple news that we're also going to dive into deeper. So we've had a lot of activity around, how can we unify this travel experience? How can we bring digital identities into this physical realm, meeting, what arguably is maybe the highest assurance use case you can meet right now, which is, the government's standards for getting on a plane. We've had the delay of the Real ID rollout, which I believe is going to take effect in the next couple of years now. So you're going to have continued demand for how can consumers meet this high standard to get on a plane with a minimum of friction. So going to be really interesting to see how Clear puts this capital to work. We had seen them attempting to push into stadiums for kind of touchless purchases, biometric enabled, beer purchases and age verification in NFL stadiums, for example. I think COVID took some of the wind out of those sales because of the fact that nobody could go to large events. But now that we are back on, NFL just announced that every stadium is going to be at capacity for this upcoming football season. I think you're going to see a lot more movement in terms of Clear trying to expand that footprint that they have, move beyond just the airport, and try and become the leading biometrics and identity platform for age verification, biometric enabled purchases at, large gatherings of people, whether that's concerts, whether that's stadiums, whether that is the airport. So I think you are going to expect to see Clear put that capital they've raised to use, continuing to expand their footprint and justify the cost of that user subscription by enabling use cases that appeal to more than just like the hardcore travelers, business travelers like us three who are all Clear members, I believe. Trying to convince people like, hey, you maybe are not getting on the plane as much, but we want to enable these seamless experiences for you in all of these other opportunities in your life.
Yeah. Well, I got to admit, I recently went through JFK. Clear probably shaved off 45 minutes or an hour for me. It's just right out of the gate. I'm like, all right, we're back. We're back to traveling in JFK.
I mean, I also went to the airport. It was shocking to me how, the TSA pre-check line was shut down, but you could still go through the Clear line. Funny how that works. Anyways,
funny how that works.
Just to say Clear, it's also another one that's consistent with another theme that we've talked to a lot more, which is kind of this verticalized identity solution. You focus on a specific niche, you can then get to scale and then start to move horizontal. And it's just a great go-to-market strategy. Clear, I think a few years ago was having financial difficulties. Now they're talking about a $4 billion IPO. So kudos to them.
Yeah. Fantastic story. And I think that kind of goes right into the Pangiam TrueFace acquisition. Cameron, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Continue talking about this one. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, another exciting development. I think you are seeing a potential competitor to Clear for, primacy around this, curb to gate. Some folks are calling it couch to gate, starting even earlier, letting digital identity be this true horizontal that empowers each step of the way of your journey as a traveler. We know the Pangiam team already purchased Veriscan this year. That is a platform that really had focused on, gate level biometrics. I think this TrueFace acquisition is another tuck-in that is strengthening the capabilities of that platform. I think it's safe to say that they are on the prowl and looking to continue building out the capabilities so that they can develop a true competitor to Clear. So I don't think this is the last we have heard from the Pangiam team, and we really expect them to emerge as a major competitor to the newly public Clear when it comes to, again, enabling a truly seamless digital identity powered experience for the modern traveler.
Yeah. Let's keep things going here. We're going to talk a little about, so we have ID R&D being acquired by MyTech. Again, kind of re-hitting on this from kind of the last slide. MyTech raised a bunch of money to do M&A activity, right? They were pretty open about this. They said, we are going to go buy companies for this. ID R&D being kind of that first one tells you it's a pretty clear signal on where they're going to focus some of these efforts. I think ID R&D is going to strengthen a lot of the technology as well as just geographic scope, right? For MyTech, obviously, ID R&D is, I believe, mostly out of Russia, right? And out of parts of Europe. So, adding in this biometrics and IDV side of things, MyTech already has a really good stack on this front, but bringing in the biometrics capabilities, I think, is a smart move, especially with, I think, the importance in growing demand for biometrics technologies by companies here in the short to medium term. And moving on, because I know we want to keep going here and keep up with time, but NCAP security. Again, we already kind of introduced this being acquired by All Clear ID back in 2016. Really, one of the kind of premier SCA companies out there. Really focused on European compliance with PSD2 as well as GDPR. Picking this up, Signicat is really kind of just securing their position in the driver's seat. We know that the bank ID programs have just a really, really strong tech stack. And for those of you that are not super familiar with the bank ID programs, there are many, many bank ID programs out there. You have Norway, you have Sweden. They're both called bank ID. You can kind of go across the board. It's a pretty common term out there used for productizing a lot of open banking style identity verification and government identity verification stacks. NCAP security being plugged into that is kind of leading the charge in terms of offering these types of solutions to users. And Signicat is the company kind of bringing all this together. So if I were a betting man, I would look at Signicat and probably assume they're going to start picking up some of these monopolistic bank ID programs within these countries and start to build out just one unified platform that sits on top of this entire universe. And then lastly is Unify ID. So, I guess Cameron, Dave, do you guys have any thoughts on this acquisition?
Look, I mean, I think this is an example of something I mentioned earlier, very clear example where, Prove was previously, a lot of their value proposition was being able to aggregate and provide sort of a unified view of primarily third-party data about customers in a B2B2C context. And so now you have somebody who's moving from sort of more deterministic data, have built sort of very nice distribution, have distribution at scale, and is now picking up a probabilistic data vendor. Behavioral biometrics are probabilistic. And so now can a company like Prove shift into this other sort of data set, help bring that to scale, potentially unlock some sort of network effect or flywheel effect. If I were an investor, if I were on the board of Prove, that's what I would see as the sort of the core value proposition or strategic add to an acquisition like this. And, it'll be something to watch over the next, 24 to 36 months.
Yeah, I think, the digital identity lifecycle, as we like to call it, is the trend that is powering a lot of this investment, whether it's these acquisitions or whether it's companies going out to raise money on the promise of future acquisitions. You have players who had a strong foothold in a single piece of the life cycle, and they're recognizing that in order to keep fueling the level of growth they want to see, they need to branch out and capture other pieces of the life cycle. So whether you have players who have been focused on the identity creation or identity verification pieces, they're moving into how can we move beyond that single point in time and continue to authenticate folks, drive revenue from having a persistent presence in companies' digital identity stack beyond just that T+0 single moment in time of onboarding. I think you're seeing that with Prove and Unify ID as well. Obviously, if you just have a platform that relies on, folks reaching out to a call center for occasional authentications of, okay, I'm calling Chase to check on my account balance. Let's make sure I'm not a fraudster. The Unify ID capabilities and ability to provide true authentication across the customer's interactions with their accounts. This enables them to continue driving revenue with more touch points, more ongoing touch points with that consumer, different pieces of that life cycle. So that's, the trend I'd call it there.
Yeah, and if you're looking at this map here, you can see where some of these dots landed, right? You have 3 dots in authentication, 3 dots in biometrics, 2 dots in IDV. Very consistent trend with what we've been seeing in the last couple of months, probably what we're going to continue to see going forward. These are growth markets and they're maturing, right? So you can probably expect to see more activity in these specific markets, as well as, of course, fraud prevention and risk management and the customer IAM side, which we've seen a lot in the past few months. But let's go ahead and move forward to our next segment here with this awesome image around basically industry news that we think is extremely important that will likely continue to have a strong effect on the market. And you guys should all be aware of it. So the first one here is the Apple iOS 15 identity announcement. So with this, Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit kind of about this announcement and what's going on with Apple and your thoughts on it?
I mean, look, my big thought when I saw, so, with Apple, one of the important things to remember is that, they release features to reinforce the strength of their product, right? So the more we use their devices, that's what Apple cares about. The better the user experience gets, the more places we can use their devices. That supports the margins. That supports the profit margins for which they can sell their devices, right? Like, I think we all know that Apple devices have a much higher premium and margin than Android devices or Google devices or Samsung devices, et cetera. This is one of the ways they do that, is they're constantly rolling out features, which previously, I mean, there was no shortage of kind of like people who were looking at mobile driver's licenses. That's been a self-sovereign identity use case at various points that, hey, we can do, this sort of credential we can do as an MDL. And now we see sort of Apple just being like, well, we can do that too. And by the way, the user experience is going to be much, much better. I think the other thing that I look at is, to what extent is this going to be similar to Apple Pay? I think in the US, uptake of Apple Pay was pretty slow and pretty unremarkable and potentially, underperforming, or at least wasn't meeting expectations that we're accustomed to from Apple. And then we saw an event like COVID happen, and all of a sudden there was much greater uptake in contactless payments, particularly on the mobile device. That way, I'm only touching something that I control. I don't want to touch or use sort of shared surfaces or shared devices. So COVID was great for Apple Pay adoption and use. So it'll be interesting to see how something like this is released sort of post-COVID. How does that, how does all the new places that we're now going to be using QR codes for identity, or there's going to be this behavioral shift, and to what extent is that going to be a tailwind or a headwind for an initiative like this? I think it's just something to kind of watch and wait and see.
Yeah. And Cameron, what are your, I mean, this is obviously, I think Dave's kind of hit on all the major points there around Apple's need to build ecosystem and continue to add features into this to build value. And that puts them in kind of a driver's seat in terms of being able to offer these types of services at a loss, which is obviously something that other identity wallets could not do, right? We've seen there's a very large graveyard of identity wallet companies, right? And so seeing this kind of happen, long time coming. But what are your general thoughts on this? And do you think this is going to be successful?
I do. I mean, don't bet against Apple launching successful consumer-facing products. I think is one of Cameron's rules to live by. So wouldn't bet against them. I think the major challenges they face are they are diving into a market, to your point, that is filled with the skeletons of those startups who have come before them and failed. And I think the challenges that they face are kind of subtly revealed in their press release. They talk about, the late 2021 timeframe. This is a company that oftentimes announces exactly when things are going to launch, exactly when it's going to ship, when pre-order is going to happen. They don't have a defined timeframe for when they're going to be live, and they explicitly call out they're taking this on a quote state by state basis. I think that highlights this super fragmented landscape when it comes to MDLs in general, mobile driver's licenses. Sorry for the slang. And the fact that they are really going to have to take a true 50-state approach to this. There is no national standard. They haven't said if they're going to play along with the emerging ISO standard for mobile driver's licenses. They haven't talked about, what federation capabilities, to the extent you can kind of take verified attributes and maybe passport them into other applications. Like, let's say I want to apply for a credit card with Chase on iOS, Can I double click, authenticate myself with Face ID, let them see my verified and TSA vetted, identity attributes? They haven't disclosed any of that. So I think, especially with digital identity like this, the devil is going to be in the details. I wouldn't bet against them, but just how effectively they're able to get all 50 states and all types of identity credentials that are required for this ecosystem to be successful loaded in there, I think is a tremendous challenge, and remains to be seen if they can hit the mark there.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Last month we did one of our predictions, or my prediction, not to pat myself in the back, was about personal identity ecosystems, pies. Of course, we expect big tech to kind of lead these personal identity ecosystems in the future. Apple making this announcement, a little bit of a surprise right after our session. That was not intentional by any stretch, but not super surprising, because we are seeing not just Apple do this. We should expect Google, we should expect Apple, we should expect Microsoft, all the big tech companies to have some form of identity wallet capability here very shortly, which means that there's a massive opportunity, in my opinion, to support Apple and all these companies with these larger integrated identity platforms, which is typically what we've been calling them, but building ways to connect individuals with some of this information. You can even see it here in the graphic, right? With a government issued ID with the information from a mobile device, right? With additional information that's not sitting on top of your driver's license. So once we start adding these things together, no one currently has a full stack approach to it. That's not super reliant on heavy partnerships. That kind of eliminates a lot of the profitability of those companies. But expect to see more evolution for platforms that support companies like Apple with this. So to your point, don't bet against them, but also look at the opportunities for the companies in the space that can support Apple. And if you guys are interested about the Apple iOS 15 announcement, our former head of OWI Labs, which is our research division here, Neil Hughes, has written a very good and extensive brief on this announcement, including the identity breakdown, or what's happening in the identity wallet, on Apple Insider. So I would definitely implore all of you guys to go check out the Apple Insider article from Neil Hughes on this and to read more about it. Which, let's actually move to our next topic here, which I think kind of had an equal amount of buzz, frankly, within the industry, maybe even more, which was really Stripe. Stripe announcing Stripe Identity was I think a bit of a surprise and shock to many out in the space. A lot of identity verification companies. We've been talking for the last 40 minutes or so about identity verification companies. Now we have the behemoth that is Stripe get into the game. Something again that we, think people kind of naturally thought this, right? It's kind of hard to say we're the Stripe for identity and not expect Stripe to be the Stripe for identity eventually, right? However, I think TechCrunch made that same joke with 4 or 5 different press releases on TechCrunch talking about that. But really big opportunity, makes a tremendous amount of sense for Stripe. We know what's under the hood at Stripe. They have many vendors already integrated to do KYC and identity verification for themselves, right? And so this makes a tremendous amount of sense for them. They have the who's who of vendors in the stack already to be able to pull from and to build on top of. As you can see here, it's very easy. They really kind of represent the no code, low code push into market, which has not been a successful go-to-market approach for many companies in this space previously, specifically the identity verification space. Obviously very successful for companies like Twilio and Auth0, but no one yet for the identity verification space for the low-code, no-code. So seeing them kind of go forward, that makes this a very interesting opportunity, really pushing heavy in that. But also, if you go and read, if you go listen to the announcement and you go read about what they kind of leading with, they're really pushing for trust and safety and ATO, fraud prevention, as the 2 main reasons why you want to have this installed or to be using this program. Then third, KYC. I think that's quite interesting. Obviously, I think a lot of companies lead with regulations or regulatory compliance first, and then fraud prevention second. A little bit different there. And then lastly, we have on the page here what's included at this is at launch, mind you. This is not the, I'm sure we'll see more things get added to this, but leading with the user experience, kind of those built-in user workflows, very easy, no code, low code environment. They have verification for government IDs in 33 countries. So, interested to see, why those 33 to go through them. They're the countries you kind of expect, very Western, kind of deployable, mostly where that you're seeing a lot of digital use. And then you're also seeing some of the face biometrics component with the selfie detection. And then, of course, everything else that you kind of goes along with that. Cameron, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, yeah, what are your general thoughts on Stripe, the identity platform, and how this changes things?
Yeah, I mean, I think this changes things in a big way, in the sense that if you are an IDV vendor that is selling into your customers that are already using Stripe for payments, it's going to be tough. Stripe already has the integration into so many platforms. And the fact that they can offer the full payment stack and then throw identity on top is kind of the cherry on top of that ice cream sundae. I think it's going to be an incredibly compelling solution for those customers of theirs that are already fully integrated. I think it may be tough for them to penetrate into the customers that are not using Stripe for payments, because if you're going to choose to integrate someone and you're competing with them on the payment side, why would you go with Stripe? But for that slice of the market that already is leveraging Stripe for that payment stack, I think it is going to be an incredibly compelling value proposition. I think we've seen the competitive differentiators in terms of IDV kind of flatten out in the sense of platform capabilities. There's a lot of really high quality players out there, and they've been trying to differentiate themselves in a number of different ways, whether it's adding on, horizontal capabilities across the lifecycle, moving into low code, no code. And I think Stripe is ticking a few of those boxes in terms of saying, look, you're already integrated with us. It's going to be one invoice together. You're doing payments. Throw a couple more lines of code in. We'll take over IDV and take this off your plate. You don't have to worry about it. So I think watch out for the folks who are having to compete with them head to head.
Yeah, Dave, I'm going to leave it up to you for the last words on this Stripe identity piece. What are your general thoughts, and is there something as an investor that this kind of triggers for you? Is there something that says, like, hey, be mindful of this? Or
well, look, I mean, it's analogous to the comments that we've been making for the last couple of months around how we're going to see M&A activity. It's a different manifestation of the same theme, but look, we all talk about how, in the identity ecosystem, like, payments and identity, they're actually like the same thing, right? And so here we have a company that's built up, has a strong network effect in payments, and is now saying, like, look, it's very easy for us to now move upstream into identity. We've got incredible distribution. We've got, great distribution infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. It's very easy to move into identity. I think in our other comments, we're talking about how companies which are in identity or IDV, now it's very logical for them to acquire and bolt on other things. And in different markets, in different industries that you're serving, we're going to see that consolidation or that integration. If it's a company with a new product release, the market structure and distribution of different players is going to define how we see, is somebody moving from identity into payments or identity into fraud and risk, or are we seeing them move from fraud and risk and payments out into identity verification. And this is just a different manifestation of that, driven by different market structure.
Yeah, I think what's to me really quickly on this, I know I said I was going to give you the last word, but I think the big question that I'm going to be left with here is, does Stripe acquire its own capabilities, or do they continue to be a partner, be a VAR, right? So I think that's kind of that's the big question here for me. Well, let's move on to the Fields of Dreams section. No one gives me enough credit for my awesome Photoshop work on this. I'm just going to go ahead and give myself a pat on the back. But this section here is where we are going to look forward, right? So we've been kind of referencing some of these predictions and how those have played out over, since the beginning of the year. Of course, one of those that we just mentioned was the personal identity ecosystems and Apple. And then, of course, a lot more with some of the IDV and investment. But so we are going to go ahead and lead off with Dave. You have 2 predictions going into the second half of the year here. What do you got?
Right. So we saw, that Europe has announced, or the European Union has announced this, digital identity initiative. To me, it reminded me of a lot of the self-sovereign identity concept papers that started being written in 2016, 2017, where it's like, here's literally everything that you can do with identity data. And now we're going to have a mobile wallet that lets you do all of this. And so when I see a very broad, comprehensive initiative talking about this, myriad use cases with multiple government players, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to me, what it tells me is that this is going to be a very long, slow slog to get this thing off and running. So my prediction is that we're not really going to see much tangible use of whatever it is that this initiative comes before 2025. I think we've seen over the last few years, most government initiatives around digital identity have ultimately underwhelmed. I think part of that is because everybody recognizes the importance of technology and digital transformation. But when you look at some of the antitrust and political headwinds around working with big tech, people are trying to do this in a way where they're not entrenching Apple, Google, Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera. These are the companies that get user experience the best, consumer user experience. And so if you're going to do something that's going to be a mass market consumer play, and you're not going to work with Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, if you're not going to work with those 5 companies, I don't think you're going to get it right, because the people who do those things the best are at those 5 companies. And so I think it's going to be really, really tough to get this thing off the ground in a big way. And so that's kind of like my prediction. I tried to figure out how to say something that would be, sort of falsifiable. I'll think about how I can refine this further beyond just some amorphous 2025 number that's out there.
We'll check in 2025. On this one.
Yeah, no, I'll try and refine it. But I'm very skeptical that this is going to become something that a lot of people are using. So maybe there's a way to, I'll think about how to refine that more, but I'm just very skeptical. Yeah. And then, my second acquisition, or sorry, my second prediction, we've got that M&A button, what an incredible graphic that Travis has once again come up with. A few months ago, I said, look, identity verification companies are going to raise $1 billion this year. That's now happened basically, but within 2 quarters. When you look at Trulioo, Jumio, ID.me, Persona, a few others, they've already hit that $1 billion bogey. It's going to be $2 billion by the end of the year. I think we've already seen some M&A. We've been talking about that for several months now. There's multiple deals every time we do one of these investor updates. To me, most of them to date have looked like bolt-on, tuck-in, some acqui-hires, which are lower deal values. We haven't really seen, things that are much more, that start to look more like mergers. And so I do think that we're going to start to see some M&A activity that reflects much more of what you would typically see in sort of like the private equity markets, where you have much bigger raises so that you can have a merger where maybe some shareholders take out some cash, but it really ends up looking more like a merger of equals or a relative value merger, rather than what we're seeing right now, which are much more of these like smaller, like tuck-in acquihires. And so to do that, I think we're going to see some M&A activity where in conjunction of that, we're going to again see 9-figure raises, which could be, $200, $300, $400, $500 million raises announced in conjunction with some M&A activity. So I definitely see us going over $2 billion by the end of the year, and it very easily could get into $3, maybe $4 billion.
All right, we heard it here first. All right, Cameron, you have Latam here. What's going on? What's your prediction?
So for those of you who've been following the Copa America, I think Brazil has a really strong chance to win the tournament.
Bold, Cameron. Bold.
But moving away from soccer, and back into digital identity. I think LATAM really a hotbed right now for some really exciting fraud startups and digital identity startups. I think in many ways, the kind of mobile payments revolution that we saw emerge from Africa with the advent of M-Pesa and some of the really fantastic technologies that were born out of a lack of, traditional kind of desktop computing infrastructure. On the payment side of things, we are seeing a lot of that same emergence of really exciting startups driven by the high fraud rates in LATAM, the mobile first environment, and the emergence of many of the same platforms, online to offline, whether it's delivery, e-commerce, ride sharing, some really, really cool stuff happening. And I think the markets are starting to take notice. Just in the past few months, we've had ID Wall raise 38 million. We had InLoco get acquired, but spin out their anti-fraud location-based platform Incognia, who now has a significant US presence. You have the startup Combat.Fraud, really doing successful launches in Brazil and across Latin America. You have ClearSale, which emerged out of Brazil to build a very strong presence here in the US e-commerce fraud market. So lots of exciting startups to watch. I think you're going to continue to see LATAM-based digital identity and fraud startups emerge and have really compelling technology. Again, because of lack of complete 4G penetration, so platforms that can successfully work on lower bandwidth environments, mobile first, diversity of different types of handsets, not just iOS and top tier Android handsets, in addition to the multitude of different types of identity credentials that are predominant in markets like Brazil, very similar to the US in that on a state by state basis, different ID formats, varying degrees of quality. And the platforms that have emerged to successfully tackle those challenges, they're going to be extremely competitive in markets like the US, where you have a bit more consistency to the documents, higher bandwidth, higher quality devices, kind of forged in this crucible, if you will, of a much more challenging threat environment. And I think that's giving some of these startups a real leg up when they look to come to the US. So keep an eye on that, expecting to see a lot more money flowing into these startups and a lot more of these startups looking to make the jump from markets like Brazil, Argentina, up to the US.
Yeah, I think it's a really good call out, especially with ID Wall, like you mentioned, raising 38 million bucks for the Series C, and just the overwhelming amount of interest in the space as well. So I think this is a really good prediction. All right, and then last but maybe least is my prediction here is that we are starting to see the early signs of a peak in this market. I think that we might not be there yet. I wouldn't actually disagree with Dave's $2 billion assessment. I think that's probably where we're heading. There's a lot of deals in progress right now. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff still left to invest in and put out to market. But that all said, we are starting to see some pretty significant pushback from institutional investors, which is usually an interesting sign. A lot of European investors are backing away from the market as a result. So we do expect, or at least my prediction is that we are starting to see the peak here in terms of this big wave of investment in the space. And what I do expect to see for the next 24 months is more M&A, more consolidation, and maybe some down rounds. And so I expect to kind of see maybe a lot of the forward-looking projections not panning out the way that investors had hoped, and those leading to some really great opportunities for M&A and building out stronger integrated identity platforms to support the growing personal identity ecosystems that we're starting to see.
Yeah, I mean, look, just to for one, maybe interject some disagreement for once.
Yep.
I actually think we're a ways away from the peak. I think until the COVID related tailwinds are going to continue for at least another 12 to 24 months, and until we start to see some of that fade away, or actually more realistically, until those some of those secular trends really complete, and companies struggle to maintain their growth rates, I don't think we can say that's peaked. And so for me, I really think that maybe the type of peak or that and the dynamics that Travis is describing, I actually think that's going to be about 2 years out, because we've just seen all of these funding rounds take place, and I think it's really the life cycle of those fundraisers to where you then start to see down rounds. So like, I don't think that's going to happen for another 2 years at least, just because I think the growth rates are going to, maybe they'll cool off a little bit, but we're still going to see some very attractive growth rates for another 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, and typically, just for if you're a new listener to this webinar, he's typically supposed to be the pessimist, and so that will tell you where we're landing on this. We'll probably definitely be rechecking in on some of these predictions in a few months here, but we'll see how those start to pan out. We'd love to hear what you guys think about today's session. This is a webinar session. Typically, we do these live, and so this is something new for us. So please do share your feedback in that link in the description. Let us know how we did or ways to improve. Obviously, we're constantly changing the way that we do these sessions, and would love your feedback. But with that, we do have some upcoming events for the summer. In July 13th, we have the Cybercrime Landscape, part of our digital forum series. And then later in the month, of course, having our next Investing in Identity forum, which is this webinar here for July. And then in August, we are going to have a masterclass with Prove. So we've obviously talked a lot about Prove today. And the Unify ID acquisition. If you're interested in that, I know that we are also putting together a white paper to kind of break down Unify ID and Prove and what does that mean in the future. And this session here will likely build on top of that. So I think it's really, really important to understand what companies like Prove are doing. So please do add that to your calendar in the future. And with that, thank you all for joining us on this webinar. If you have any questions about OWI or want to get in touch with us just to talk identity or learn more about how we can help you and your business, or contact Dave for potential investments, you can contact us at info@oneworldidentity.com, and we'll get the communications where they need to go. With that, thank you, everybody, and have a great summer.